Hello, I'm Dan Earlywine and welcome to my shop here in Big Rapids, Michigan. It's raining up there, it's cold and chilly outside, and it's October. That sort of makes me want to stay inside today. It's Saturday, sort of a relaxing day, and build a guitar. Many thanks to my friends at StewMac for inviting me to be your instructor and for sending me these great chunks of alder to make a body for this guitar. I've chosen as a model this old Strat from the late 50s that I've had for many years. It's somewhat easier than other guitars to make because it has a bolt-on neck construction and it's fairly straightforward in design. Before we do any sawing, I'd like to get my safety glasses and a few measuring tools and acquaint you with the basic 7 steps as I see them to putting this guitar together. I hope you enjoy this tape. Follow this schedule. Study the plans that come with your tape. If you wish to use your own design, make your own plans. I'll give you some good ideas about how to draw and lay out on wood. And get together all the materials that you'll need for this guitar. From the lumber to the pickups to the tuning machines, a bridge, an input jack, pickguard, wire. You know the parts that make up a Strat. Square up the stock on a planer, bringing the rough lumber down to 1 3/4 for the body and 1 inch for the neck. The body will be alder, the neck will be maple. If you don't have the tools, look up your local high school or a local mill shop. The neck construction and body construction will be done mostly on the bandsaw with some help from a router and a drill press. We will put a truss rod in the neck, mount the fingerboard, and bandsaw each to shape. We'll follow that with the hand rasp, shaping the neck and the body mostly by hand, and starting with 80 grit sandpaper, work our way all the way up to 400 for a smooth finish. Speaking of finish, before we actually spray anything, I'm going to pre-fit every part so we don't scratch things later. I'll give you a few tips about making your own pickguard, although I plan to use a pre-made pickguard. They're so easily available these days. The final sanding and finishing means you're almost done. We'll use wet sandpaper to wet sand out the 6 coats of lacquer that we lay on the body, and I think I'll put an old antique sunburst on this to give it that vintage look. When you get to the 7th and final stage, you're ready to assemble the guitar. A good word of advice would be to watch the whole tape from beginning to end before you do anything, so you get a good general idea of how the whole guitar process goes together. You'll need a piece of wood glued up from 2 or 3 pieces that will be 13 inches wide and 18 inches long. It will be 1 3/4 inches thick. That'll be 1 solid block of wood when it's glued together, and you'll plane it to 1 3/4. For the neck, you'll need a block of maple, 25 3/4 inch long, make it 26, at least 2 1/4 inches wide to get the width of the widest part of the neck. Get a block 4 inches wide if you'd like to cut a solid peg head out of the same block. Otherwise, you'll glue the ears on the peg head to the 2 1/4 inch stock. It should be 1 inch thick, a blank of maple 1 inch thick. Try to get it quarter sawn if you can. The block of maple that I'm using for my neck is 1 1/8 thick and 3 1/2 inches wide. It's got a fairly straight grain running end to end, and it's almost a quarter sawn pattern, meaning that the grain runs up and down. You'll see many guitars that the grain runs lengthwise this way. Makes for a little weaker neck, but go ahead and use it if that's all you can find. These grains run pretty close to square. I suspect as I got deeper into the piece it'll square right up. Looking at my board from the end, it's quite warped from one end to the other. Well, not quite, perhaps 1/8 of an inch overall. I've chosen the center of this board where the grain is the straightest for my neck. I'm going to cut that off with the skill saw. I don't need the whole board, and it's a little warped on each end. I'm going to where the grain starts to straighten out. It tapers off and gets crooked there, and way down here it does. In here it's pretty straight. I need a blank 26 inches roughly long. When I got towards the center of that board, this grain is pretty straight, and it became almost quarter sawn in there from end to end. That's a good piece of maple for making a neck out of. Now I've included a set of plans with this tape to build the guitar that we're about to get into, but if you want to do some layout work of your own, here's some handy tools that I always use for making drawings, and I'll give you a few pointers on how to lay out a guitar. Let's say you want to choose a different shape or a different type construction. I couldn't get along without an artist pen. It's commonly known as a rapidograph because that was the first company that came out with it. It's got a very fine point and leaves a good ink mark in thin black lines on your paper. Various lengths of good quality straight edges. If you use a straight edge to mark with a pen, it's best to put a little masking tape on the back of it to raise it up off the board so that you don't get a blurry line. Often if you run along a straight edge without tape on it, you'll get a blur as you move the straight edge away. It'll drag the ink. With tape on the back, it gives you a clear line because the actual straight edge is up off the table. There's a ruler without any tape on it. And if you move around, you can drag the ink and make marks. Here's a piece of masking tape on the bottom. You get a clean line. Always lift the straight edge up when you can anyhow. You'll find all sorts of different shapes at an art supply store on pieces of plastic. These are ellipse patterns. I can draw the pocket for the input jack with these. I used a 25-degree ellipse to do the input jack on this body that we're about to do. A collection of French curves is very handy. You can make any shape you like. You can follow almost any curve on any guitar with these. A good French curve has a raised edge so the ink won't drag onto the paper. French curves are nice to have. Perhaps a circle pattern and an ellipse pattern. You can draw circles with these various sized holes. Do a neat job that way. Various sized straight edges. Here's an 18 machinist square. Here's a 12. Here's my favorite. This is 36 inches long. It's got a ground and beveled edge. Any guitar builder that's serious should invest in one of these at some point. It's also parallel in width. This is parallel to that surface all the way down. You can use that for layout often. My favorite tool of all is this adjustable rubber straight edge. It becomes a French curve. It becomes any shape you want. It has a raised edge so you don't drag ink. That's a great tool. And of course you better get yourself a rapidograph eraser to erase this ink with if you make mistakes as often as I do. Here's a few pointers on laying out a guitar. Take a block of scrap wood and lay a bead of superglue along one thin face of it. You'll need your accelerator. Accelerator hardens superglue on contact. Lay a pencil with one flat side. I flattened that on the belt sander. Lay it so that the lead comes flush with the bottom. Give it a spritz of accelerator. Let that glue set. Now there's a handy little tool to mark along the edge of your guitar body with. That's how I go about tracing a body. Pencil glued to a block of wood. With the 6-inch stainless steel rule, you gotta get one of those. Any hardware store has them. Pick up the center line at the nut in the 12th fret. I clamp my 36-inch straight edge down that center line on the neck, and now I can locate a center line on this body, which is asymmetrical in shape. There's a mark that I made by running a square up to the straight edge, and I made that little ink mark. There's a center line. The same at the opposite end. I get a good center there, and I got a good center there. I marked it on masking tape so I wouldn't draw on the paint. From that center line, I can lay out the whole guitar. Everything is on centers. With a piece of masking tape running the full length of the edge, and the edge is butted right up against the nut. That's where my scale length begins. I could mark out the location of every fret. Making special attention to the 12th fret. That's our octave, of course. I can make a mark where the body joint is. It's right below this fret. That's where the neck joins the body. Where the neck ends, I could mark where the pickups start, approximate positions of the cavities, for example. And last but not least, the location of the tremolo pocket in the exact center of the bridge mounting screws. You'll notice this old guitar has no frets in it. I was just about to refret it before I started this tape. The straight edge is now a story pole. It shows you the nut end, all the frets, location of the 12th fret, the end of the neck, the location of the pickup pockets, the bridge screws in the bridge. Thanks to my center line on the body, I was able to lay a piece of clear plastic over the body, line it up on centers, and pick up all the locations of the pickup holes, the bridge, the insert, the input jack pocket, etc. That's how I went about this job. Tracing the peg head was easy. Once again, I laid it up on the center line. Everything was on centers. Tracing the body was easy. And then I lined up my clear plastic over that center line once again, measuring from this end out to that line where the tremolo pocket was. There's my basic layout of this old Strat. Plans were covered with a large sheet of Mylar, that's a plastic drawing paper, lined up on centers, and I made my final drawing, which you will receive with the tape. So much for how to draw a guitar. Let's get on with squaring up the wood. Hope these pointers have been helpful. With most pieces of wood, you'll notice that the grain will lay one direction or the other. It'll lay like little fibers and fingers, and you can get under it one way but not the other. Pay attention to that on these pieces of wood. If the grains are running this way and actually they're lifting up that direction, the piece of wood should feed this direction. The cutter bits will come that direction with the grain. That way you won't tear out any chunks. Here's the narrow side of the board, and here's the long, wide side. The grain is running this direction. Here is against the grain. I'm lifting up on the grains. This way rolls the grain down. Usually two adjacent corners will match each other. The grain's going that way and this way. So for that, you should feed it into the planer that direction, so the cutter will be coming with the grain. If you have an overly thick piece of wood, as I do, this is 2 inches, you can simply edge joint each side that's going to glue together, glue the whole block up, and then run it through a large planer to bring it down to 1 3/4. The arrow means feed it that direction. Since the grain is running that direction, we feed this direction, because the cutter head is cutting this direction, and we want to cut with the grain. The cutter head is revolving that direction towards you as you stand at the end of the machine. The grain is running this direction, and the cutter head's going with the grain that way, and you feed the piece that direction. You push it into the piece. It's easy to push a large board standing on this edge through a joiner. It's a little risky when you lay it flat and your fingers come close to that cutter head. So you should make a push stick. This is a chunk of 2x4 and a block of wood. That keeps your fingers away from the blade as you're pushing through. I always ride my hand up on the fence too, just to be darn sure I'm staying away from it. It's especially true when you have to plane this thin block of maple for the adjoining fingerboard surface. When you joint that flat, you're getting down close to that blade. Use a push stick. Since most of you will probably have lumber that's very close to 1 3/4 of an inch, I'm going to bring all my wood down to size by running all the flat surfaces over the joiner and then planing it to 1 3/4 on my thickness planer. Use your push stick. I removed 1/16 of an inch off each of these 3 sides and got a flat surface. I'll now run them through the planer and bring this to 3/4 and all these down to almost 1 3/4, leaving only enough to sand. With the joiner, get one good straight edge along your piece of maple for the neck. And join up the pieces of alder, each edge nice and straight on a joiner so they glue up very tight. That'll make a good glue job. I use my best clear piece for the center. The knots I'm going to put to the outside, like I did there, because I think my body shape will miss those knots. It misses the knots on both sides. Edge joint these so we can glue them together. With these edges all jointed up, you could go right to gluing it up. If you don't want to dowel the pieces together, you'd have to use some blocks of good square wood to keep these pieces all flush with each other so they don't go like this when it's in the gluing clamps. You could go right to gluing it if you wish. Or you might want to try doweling it. I'll show you how. Remember, my blank of wood is about 20 inches long. I've got plenty of extra. If your blank is almost about 18 or 18 1/4 inches long, which is the length of the guitar, be a little more careful here. Start at the butt end where the guitar starts. I've rough traced the outline of the guitar here. Measure out 2 inches and 12 inches from the end, and that's where we'll put our dowels, at 2 and 12 inches from the end of the guitar. Be careful if you have a short blank. At the 2-inch mark, lay a straight edge out. Run a pencil line across that. The same at the 12-inch. You don't have to be too careful here, just as long as they line up. Try to be square. Take the center blank and transfer those lines with a small square down the side of the blank. Then mark up 3/4 of an inch from the bottom on each of those marks and put a crosshatch to it. That's where we'll drill our holes. Drill a hole with a 1/4 inch bit, 3/8 of an inch deep on each of those marks. I'm using a brad point bit. Now you can use a dowel center to put in that hole, and that'll make the mark on the adjoining piece. It's a quick way to transfer holes. Now with those pencil lines that we made on the top approximately lined up, when I shove these two pieces together, if they're sitting on a flat surface, we'll mark a dowel on the opposite piece over here. That's an easy way to transfer a mark. Do it on both sides of center. Each side piece that glues on should have a mark to locate the drilling hole. Make 4 little dowels almost 3/4 of an inch long, because it's 3/8 deep hole on each side. Chamfer or bevel the edges so that they hammer in easy, and we'll use those to line the blocks up when we spread our glue. Let's glue it up. I'm using Elmer's Carpenter's glue. You can use Franklin Titebond, whatever you wish. Use a yellow glue, that's what I like anyway. Work glue down into those dowel holes. Work the glue into the pores with your fingers. You don't need too much glue. I like to put it on both pieces. Some people say you don't need to. I like a thin layer on both. The bar clamp, very light pressure will squeeze those dowels home on the first set, and we can put the other side in. Now you can glue the whole mass together. Quick clean up the glue on one side and flip it over and we'll get clamps on the other side too. Get 2 clamps on the exact opposite side for even pressure. Clean up any glue squeeze out on both sides. Let this dry all day long, preferably overnight. You could unclamp it within 2 hours if you were in a super hurry, but there's no hurry. 4 clamps is plenty of pressure. These are good, strong bar clamps. While that's gluing up and drying, we can get to work on the neck. This block of wood is almost wide enough to get a full peg head out of, but this one little corner is sticking out. Well, I'll glue a piece on for that later because I like this chunk of wood. We've got to transfer the measurements to the block of wood and saw a slot down the center for the truss rod. Once again, off the center line, we need 2 1/4 to get to that side of the peg head, and only 1 3/8 to the other. I think that's what we found. Maybe 1 7/16. I've jointed one good flat square edge to the flat face, and measuring in from that edge, I'll measure in 1 7/16 and make a mark for my center line. Transfer that mark to the other end and connect them with your long straight edge. And that will be your center line, the all-important center line. With my long straight edge and masking tape, I can recreate the story pole. There's the end of the neck, there's the nut, and there's the 12th fret. There's this end of the neck. I'm using the square running along the straight edge. I can transfer that to the piece of wood. Or you could use the piece of wood if you don't have a long straight edge. Lay it right along the line and mark it right on the piece of wood. With the triangle, I can slide along and mark the location of the exact center of the tuner holes off center, measuring from the center line again. Flip the straight edge over to do the other 3. Transfer those measurements to the block of wood. I'm using a pencil. I'll ink it in later. There's my nut, down to the 12th fret, and so on. I picked up a mark where the tuners are. Now I'm marking how far out to centers. 53/64 to that one, 33/64 to that one, and 15/64 out to that one off the center line. Here's a good way to use 2 straight edges. But this straight edge up to that one, go ahead and mark out your nut so it lines up with this other straight edge. Now you can remove the big straight edge and you can pick up the other tuners on the opposite side. There's 3/64 off center, and so on. Then we'll have all 6 tuners laid out on our story pole. I'll transfer this back to the big story pole. These outer 2 holes are 4 and 11/16 inches apart. So you could just pick up these 2 holes and measure 4 and 11/16 between them, and when those marks come into line on the square marks, draw a line along that. There's a lot of ways to skin a cat. Each hole will be 15/16 from the one before it. That'll be the right spacer for the tuners. These all line up perfectly. There's the points to drill the holes. Here's another way of laying it out. If you use your plans, you can cover it with a piece of plastic, clear plastic, and pick up a center line. Then you can mark off that center line the location of each hole that you have to drill a hole into. There's one, and another, and another. You should mark out the nut also. The nut's a good locating point. If I lay this plastic on the drawing we just made, things should match up just about perfect, and they do. There's a lot of different ways you could lay this out. Clear plastic is a good one though, and you might check into where you can buy it. You can use the same method to pick up the shape of your peg head. Let's say you don't feel like cutting your plans a lot apart so you can trace around them. Use cellophane and trace that. There's yet another way of locating everything. You can cut to exact size on the cellophane or trace around it, or you could put a piece of carbon paper underneath it and transfer it that way. I'm using the carbon paper. Get my straight line there. Trace the rest of this by hand. Carbon paper underneath the cellophane. There. I think I'll use a little scribe and make a pin prick on each one of those tuning peg holes, and the layout for the peg head will be done. Now I'm going to lay out a 3/16 slot down the center of this neck, and we'll saw it 7/16 of an inch deep for the truss rod. As I lay out the center slot for the truss rod slot, I'm also going to mark the width of my nut. It's 1 11/16. That's how wide it is, which is 27/32 to each side of the center line. I'm also laying out the 12th fret. It's 2 1/16 inches wide, which is 1 1/32 out to each side. When I connect those lines, I'll have the edge marking of the fingerboard. There, I've laid out a 3/16 mark down the center. That's where the truss rod will go. I also connected the dots and got the edges of my fingerboard. Now I'll set up the table saw to cut that slot, 7/16 of an inch deep. Refer to your plans. Remember that one good edge that I ran along the joiner? Well, that's parallel to my center line, and it's parallel to the slot for the truss rod. I'll set the fence to 1 5/16, which will just touch the outside of that truss rod and cut that black area. I'll have to make 2 passes since my blade won't cut that wide a slot, 3/16. The first pass will come right up to the outside edge, and the second pass will move over here. Set the saw blade to cut 7/16 of an inch deep. And you'll be measuring from the fence to the closest tooth to the fence for your truss rod cut. That'll cut right outside to the wall of your truss rod, and then we'll have to move the fence over to cut to the other side. Before you saw the slot, remember you're going to stop short of the nut because that's how far the truss rod goes, and you wouldn't want to saw the slot all the way through the peg head. It will show later. Imagine this 7/16 inch slot, and there's a saw blade. Find the point where the blade comes in contact and is flush with the table. Follow its circumference and its diameter. Make a mark on the table saw at that point and stop this line at that mark. While the blade's cutting back here, it doesn't cut up here where it disappears into the table, and that's where I'm making my mark. That's where I'll stop the block of wood. Make the first cut and be sure to stop at that mark. Turn the saw off or have a friend turn it off, and remove the piece when the blade stops. There's my first slot, 7/16 deep, and it rises gradually up out of the piece thanks to the curve of the blade, and I had to stop on the table. We'll clean it up with a chisel or a router to get it the same depth as the major portion of the slot. Now you'll move the saw fence over whatever amount you need, let's say about a 1/16 of an inch, to get the second pass, and you'll have a 3/16 slot from end to end, which gradually rises out of the piece because you stop the saw. Slide the fence over that way to cut the second part of the wall. I'm adding a 1/16 of an inch to this measurement and moving the fence that way. Always measure at both ends of the slot, that's the slot here in the table, to the fence so that you really have a parallel fence to the blade. The second cut, be sure to stop on that mark. reminder, you may wish to clamp a board to the table with bandsawed kerfs on the end. It's called a feather board, and that'll push the maple into the fence. A block of wood with sandpaper will give you a grip there and hold it down, and a push block here. That's a better safety practice for table saw work. I'm probably getting a little nervy with my saw just because I'm so used to it. This is the proper way to go about that setup. I'm using the adjustable, two-way adjustable Stumac rod. It's going to sit to the bottom of a 7/16 deep slot. We have to carve a little deeper slot for the nut that it threads into, and we have to make a clearance hole for a socket wrench to get in there and adjust it. This is a 1/4-inch nut, 1/4-inch socket wrench. Here's how we'll go about that. You're looking at the end of the neck, body end. Imagine that's the end of the truss rod. Of course, it will have a 1/4-inch hex nut on the end of it. Down in the neck, we're going to inlay two of these lugs, these half-moon-shaped lugs. It's a double thread rod, right hand, left hand thread. That means when you tighten it, it goes one way. When you loosen it, it goes the other way. And it makes the neck go up or down. We have to make a clearance hole for the socket to get in there. We're going to make a filler strip to fill this strip, slide it in there dry, and drill a 3/8 hole right into it. That'll give us clearance around that hex nut for the socket driver. Table saw or plane, a 3/16 filler strip that'll go into that slot above the rod. You'll have to get in here with a chisel or a router and finish the depth of that slot. Remember how the saw blade didn't cut all the way to the end so we wouldn't get into the peg head. You could use an end mill in the drill press and punch a series of holes rather than a chisel. Set your depth stop to 7/16. You could use the same end mill, which cuts on the bottom a flat hole, to rough in the notch for this lug and then square that up with the chisel. Scoop it out. It's got to be sort of a round-bottomed hole. Goes a 1/16 inch lower than the 7/16 slot. It hangs down the bottom. Try to chisel a round-bottom hole. Take your time. Get a good snug fit so that when the lug's in there, the rod bottoms out on the 7/16 channel. Go ahead and chisel the hole for both lugs. When the lugs fit in at both ends, refer to your plans. Get yourself a piece of 3/16 inch maple for a filler rod and drop that in the slot. Trace along that filler slot, mark out the lugs, and we'll cut it down to size. Now's a good time to trim the end of this neck down to its final size. Remember, we cut it about 26 inches to start with, and we really wanted 25 3/4. I'm going to clamp this to my drill press table and drill a 3/8 hole in there, 1/2 inch deep. That'll let the socket go in there. Then I'll pull the rod back out before I glue it in. I've got the neck blank clamped to the side table on my drill press with 2 Jorgensen clamps, and I can drill the hole. That hole, of course, will be the clearance hole for the socket driver. Now we can remove the strip and fit it around the rod and get ready to put the rod in. Recess the socket head a 1/16 of an inch into the neck, and you'll have to chisel a little clearance for that to drop down into the slot because it's bigger than the 3/16 diameter. When the rod fits down in there, I'm going to cut that little part that we drilled the hole in off and inlay it later, notch it out for the lug, and you need about 9/32 inch of rod to get down to that steel to compress it down. Be sure to read the instructions thoroughly that come with your truss rod. I'm wrapping 1 3/4 inches of masking tape, several layers, around the center of the rod so it won't vibrate in the slack position. Follow that with a little paraffin to wax off the rod right out onto the threads so it won't stick to any glue. And before sealing it home, make sure the lug is centered in the direct center of its travel. If you want to be super cool, take a small rat tail file and file a little groove in the bottom of the filler stick that'll sort of fit around that round rod as a snug fit. And clean up that wax that you put on the threads. Don't overdo the wax, just enough to lubricate it, but you don't want to get it on the sidewalls and impede the glue job. As double insurance, I even run a little paraffin on the very bottom of that groove I created, just so it won't stick to the masking taped rod. Don't get it on the sidewalls. Paint a light coat of Titebond glue or any wood glue along both sides. Nothing too heavy, and don't let it run onto the threads. Press her down in. There's glue on both walls. Clamps on it to seat it down to the bottom and clean up that excess glue, which will squeeze up towards the top. We'll trim it flush later. You don't need a lot of tight pressure, just a gentle, even pressure, because the piece wants to fit anyway. Just squeeze it in and clean up the excess glue. You'll notice that I put the socket driver in there so that the rod couldn't squeeze down too low by any chance. I could remove the socket set wrench now. This final little filler piece I'm going to put in later and fill any gaps with a little wood filler. We'll glue that in after the neck sets up. I'm going to go take a look at that body while this dries. While the neck's drying or the rod's glued in there, I'm scraping off the excess glue and I'm going to transfer the body shape off my plans to this block of wood. After picking up a center line, of course. It's got a couple of little high spots. In spite of my doweling, I'm just picking them up with the hand plane. There's not much to it. I picked up the center of the middle block of wood and I'm striking a center line. I'm using that tracing of cellophane, picking up a center line and measuring from the butt end out to the tremolo route. You saw this piece earlier. Make yourself a tracing of the routes and we'll lay it out on the block of wood. On the center line and from the butt end, measure out 4 13/16. Make a mark. That's the rear of the tremolo pocket. Line that pocket rear up with that line and keep everything on center. When it's really perfect on center, tape it down on one side so that you can still lift it up and slide carbon paper under there. It doesn't hurt to go a little bit larger when you're tracing these pocket outlines with the carbon paper, because I made the tracing off this old vintage instrument and it's always been hard to take pickups in and out of those things. So go a little bit larger and it won't hurt anything. You'll have plenty of room for stuffing. Use your carbon paper and trace it out. I use a 3/8 radius gauge to mark the ends of the pickup routes, because that's about a 3/8 radius that you'll need. This radius gauge comes in handy. You don't need to go larger on the control pocket, and don't go any larger on the tremolo pocket either. Use the same cellophane method to take the rear shape onto the block of wood. You'll have to transfer that center line around to the other side. I use a square and I always work off the same edge. You don't want to turn the square around on either end because you might get out of line. Always work off the same side of the block of wood. See the square? There's the square. When you get those two lines, you'll want to connect them with your straight edge. We can transfer that drawing to the back using the same method. All these radiuses are 9/32. I've got a faint tracing of all the routes, front and back. And I'm going to be very careful about tracing my shape on the top before I bandsaw that out. I won't do any bandsawing until we do all this routing anyway. Be real careful tracing the body shape. Go a little bit at a time. There, it's all laid out, ready for routing. I think I'll sharpen up my router bit and lay out the depths for these different routes and show you how to go about that. First, I'm dying to take a look at this truss rod and fill those extra holes. Spoke shave down the excess. Careful not to rock off onto the main portion of the neck that's your gluing surface. When you get close, use a scraper or a file. Finally, use a scraper to scrape that filler right flush with the neck so the fingerboard will sit nice and flush. I've got the socket on the nut and wax paper over that. I'm just going to use a spritz of super glue with a little accelerator. I'm just going to set that one part in there. Forgive the noise of my spray fan, but I always run it when I mix Bondo. This is a form of Bondo. It's called Freeman's Tough Fill. It's a pattern maker's Bondo. This comes in a pine color and a mahogany color, and you mix a hardener into it. It'll harden in 3 minutes and do a good job of filling in the voids around the truss rod lugs. You can carve it down with a knife and a file as soon as it's hard. Do both lugs that way. It'll also set right around that super glue. Firm up that piece of wood. While that's drying, I'm going to take a tracing of the side view of my neck blank and pick up that curve where the fingerboard and the straight flat plane of the peg head come together. I'll transfer that using cellophane and carbon paper and trace slowly around any curves. It's hard to draw a curve in one quick smooth line. I go slowly. I'm going to mark that line right up onto my fingerboard with a white pencil, because I'll cut that at the same time by dry clamping it to the blank. The whole unit will be sanded later. I'm going to go ahead and drill my tuning peg holes with a 1/4 inch bit, because I'm going to use the old style tuner. I want to be traditional. You can go to a larger bit if you want to use Grovers or Schallers or what have you. I want to be traditional on this guitar. I'm going to try to do a real good job. Use a 1/4 inch bit and go ahead and drill the holes through. That'll be done, and when we cut the face of this peg head off for thickness, you won't have trouble locating later. I'm going to drill the hole using this butcher block as a backup. You always want a block of wood behind the neck so you won't splinter it out. Know what I'm saying? With the backer board underneath it, when you drill, you have a nice clean hole, no tear out. We can go ahead and bandsaw off this face that we just marked out. Use a square to make sure that the blade and the table are at 90 degrees. It's important, so take your time in setting up a good square cut. I got a good square cut because I clamped the neck blank to this block of ash that has a 90-degree edge here, and that kept it square. And of course I had the fingerboard clamped on and cut that at the same time. drive 2/4-inch dowels in both of these tuning pig holes, the two E-strings, and that'll keep the faceplate on tight as we bandsaw the rest of the shape of this neck. You know, before I do any bandsawing, I want to back up a bit and think. Should I glue the fingerboard on now or later? I'd prefer to glue it on right now, when I make my bandsaw cuts, it'll cut the wood, the rosewood and the maple both together. You don't have to do it that way. There's a lot of ways you could do it. This is just my way. You don't have to do it my way. Use your imagination. My cameraman is Steve Olson. He's a student here. In fact, he came and never left. Can't get rid of him. He had a question about gluing on the fingerboard. What was that, Steve?
Well, with a pre-radiused fingerboard like that, isn't it hard to get an even gluing pressure with the caul? I mean, it seems like it'd rock on the surface.
Well, sure, you couldn't put the flat board on the curved radius, it would rock. But I'll show you an easy way to do it. Lay the fingerboard on a flat block of hardwood with a slight overlap on each side and make a pencil line down each side. Lay a healthy bead of hot stuff along that line. I'm running a 3/16 wooden dowel right down that glue line and hitting it with a spritz of accelerator. Of course, when I say super glue, I don't mean just any super glue. I'm referring to hot stuff. We go through gobs of it around here. A large flat block of hardwood and a strip of double stick tape will hold that fingerboard on center. Mix up a good wad of Bondo. I use Freeman Tough Fill. It's especially made for wood in pines and mahogany colors. About a 1/4 cup or a 1/3 cup. Maybe some cream hardener as big as a large grape. You'll have to practice with mixing. It's best to do this in a fan and wear safety glasses, because if you get some of that white hardener in your eye, it could be very dangerous. Mix it well. I'm spreading it like cake frosting right onto that block of wood, and the two dowels will hold the goop all in there. Now I'm laying wax paper over the fingerboard, and I'll pick up the Bondo jig here and press it down over the fingerboard. It'll take the shape of that fingerboard perfectly. Now it's hard. About 5 minutes later, and I can trim off the excess, and I'll have a block of wood that's perfectly formed to the fingerboard. This is really a fast way of doing it. Pick up a center line on your jig so it relates to the fingerboard before you do your trimming. There's a good jig that even locks right into the nut. See how it molded down into the nut slot? Dry clamp the fingerboard to the neck blank. Get the fingerboard lined up on center with the blank and line up the nut as well. Put a clamp on each end. No glue yet. I drilled a small pilot hole a 1/2 inch each side of dead center for a brad at the 1st fret and the 12th fret. That'll keep the fingerboard from slipping when we glue it up. Drill corresponding holes at the 1st fret and the 12th fret up into the Bondo jig, larger than the head and deep enough so that the nails won't run into the jig. Temporarily drive the brads home to make the mark in the neck at the 12th and the 1st fret. By the way, when I squashed that Bondo board down onto the fingerboard, I did use clamps to apply pressure to it. I didn't have time to show that to you because that Bondo really hardens fast. Then I bandsawed off those dowels again to get a good clean joint on both sides so I could see the fingerboard. Clamp the Bondo down while it sets. Clean the bottom of the fingerboard before gluing with some lacquer thinner. Just leach out a little of that rosewood juice and make sure it's clean. Use your carpenter's wood glue or Tite Bond and get glue on the neck blank, work it into the wood, and also on the fingerboard. A thin coat on each piece is best. Line it up on centers and gently tap home those brads. Clip the heads so that they don't stick up too far. You'll pull them out with pliers later. Set on the neck gluing caul. Clamp her up. Use even pressure on all the clamps. Have a damp rag to get that glue squeeze out. Let that dry at least 3 hours. And while it's drying, let's take a look at routing that body out. If you've got a Forstner bit, you can cut a lot of meat out in these big cavities in a hurry. Otherwise, basically I'm going to use a 1/2 inch spare bit, and I'm going to rough drill a bunch of holes through the channel, through all the routs, which we can either clean up with a router or a hand chisel. This first series of holes through the routs I'm drilling a little over 5/8, perhaps 3/4. The original was 5/8. I'm going to go a little deeper to leave plenty of room for stuffing wires. Most of the guitar kits today are 3/4 deep. Later on we'll connect the dots of these holes that we're punching. For the neck pocket, however, drill exactly 5/8. Set your depth stops to either 3/4 or 5/8 depending on your hole, and that way you'll be sure that you'll always drill to the right depth. When I set my depth stop, I'm setting it so that the point is the bottom of the hole. This is a brad point bit, and it cuts a clean hole. That's why I use them. That'll leave a little bit of wood to clean up later with the router. I find that to be the simplest way of doing it. Set your stop to the point of the bit. That's important. While I'm at it, I'm drilling the holes for the neck mounting screws in the rear. I'm using a number 20 bit, 161 thousandths. Drill all 4 of those while you're at it. All the holes are drilled to the right depths here. I drilled 2 holes clean through here because that's where the tail bar of the tremolo goes. They come right out the back here and there. The rest of this cavity you route out from the rear. Once again, looking at the guitar we're copying, there's a little ledge there because we're drilling through and routing from this side and stopping short of the top, about 1/4 inch ledge. Don't forget that. The tremolo block comes through this basically 1/2 inch route. That's located off the 2 holes I just showed you. Connect the dots with a saber saw, or you could use a large coping saw. By the way, before I'm making these cuts, I have gone along with my X-Acto knife and serrated the wood so it won't tear out. I did it on the front and the back so that jagged saber saw blade won't rip the wood out. You can clean out a lot of that crud in a hurry with a chisel before even bothering to use a router. Be careful, don't just go wailing at it. You don't want to tear the grain out from the bottom. We're just trying to gently lift most of these pieces out of there. We'll clean it up with our router. Here I'm using a 1/4 inch single fluted carbide tip bit. It doesn't have to be a 1/4 inch, whatever you have and will fit. I'm measuring from the cutter edge to the outside of my router's faceplate. I measure 2 11/16 to the outside of the router's base.
Transfer the measurement from the bit's cutting edge out to your router base and clamp a board as a fence. Now you can ride the router along any straight line against that fence. The round parts you'll have to route by hand, but doing all the straight edges is a big help if you use a fence. I've clamped a board to my block and I'm riding along the table on my drill press using a milling bit. It cuts a flat bottom hole on a high-speed setting, acts sort of as a pin router. I'm cleaning up the tremolo cavity with that. I'm using the same end mill to plunge all the way down from the back route to the front route, leaving that 1/4 inch ledge between the two holes. Remember, they were different sizes for the tremolo block and the rear route. An end mill's a good way to approach an edge, cutting half a hole like these saber saw and drill marks that we cut through. I can clean that up with the end mill if I take it a little bit at a time. Use the same milling bit to cut to the bottom of the channels for the electric controls and the input jack. Cuts a flat bottom hole. Don't try to hog into the wood. Cut a little part of the hole at once, because you can cut into a piece of the drill bit hole and route it away there. Approach the walls and clean the chaff from the bottom. Now the bit only cuts half of its length, so you can run it to the bottom and set your depth stop, lock the quill in place. And if you turn it on the high speed, you can route the bottom to match the top, and it'll ride along the smooth shank of the bit, sort of as a collar. You've got to hold the block very firm. With the holes routed, front and back, we can go ahead and bandsaw out the body shape and the neck as well. It's been several hours in the neck's dry. The jig did a great job of clamping that fingerboard perfectly flat and really holding it down tight. I'm going to remark the 2 lines on the edges of the fingerboard. Somewhere along the line I lost them a bit, and I'm going to remark them with a white pencil, and then we can bandsaw it to shape after removing the metal pins. This one's a little stubborn, you know. I think I'll use a soldering gun and heat these up. That's a good idea. You could clip it off in the slot. So I'm heating it with the tip of my soldering pencil to soften the glue. Now it comes out easy. That's a good tip. Mark out your bandsaw line along the fingerboard with a white pencil. That maple blank gets thinner as it tapers towards the 1st fret. At the 1st fret, the maple itself would measure 19/64 from fingerboard to the back of the neck. Mark that on your blank. At the 14th fret, where it runs out to 0 into the 3/4 inch blank, it measures 23/64. Some necks don't have any dip there. Some of these fender necks come straight off the bottom of the block and taper to the 1st fret. Quite honestly, that's sort of a very thin, hard line to cut on the bandsaw anyhow. Do it if you want. You've got to get it square on the table to cut it. You can always rasp it down later. There's not much to cut off. There's the taper running from the end of the neck to the nut. It's easy to bandsaw the rest of these shapes. If you decide to cut the back angle, it's really only a shaving. I've clamped a 3/4 inch board to my blank to help hold it square, because it's a pretty thin piece of wood at this point.
unless you have a 1/4 inch blade or less, it's kind of hard to get around a curve. So cut a series of kerf marks in there with the bandsaw to relieve it. And as the bit gets to it, the blade gets to it, it'll fall off. Those little chunks will fall out of the way. Like a dummy, I forgot to glue a scrap of maple on there. Oh well, I'll glue a piece of maple that I just cut off the peg head. It'll match the grain real well. I should have done it earlier. Cut a chunk out and glued it on, but do it now. Glue a scrap of that peg head maple back on for the ear. We're going to clean up the body with drum sanders on the drill press. That's why it's important to bandsaw as carefully as you can. We'll clean up these edges either on the belt sander or with a hand file. Start with a coarse drum, and as you get closer to the body shave, you can switch to a finer grit. Use a fairly good speed on the drill press. If you decide to use the belt sander to flatten out the edges of this neck, you should probably get on your hands and knees to do it. You've got a wide surface here, it'll sit plenty square on the belt sander, and keep a good light on it and really watch your edge. Don't be afraid to work it down by hand also. The idler drum right here will catch that curved radius on this edge of the peg head. The little one, however, pick up with a smaller drum sander on your drill press. If you're a little squeamish on the belt sander, go ahead and use a file and just work down to your pencil mark. It's important to have a nice flat edge from end to end on this edge of this neck. Here I've got the neck clamped into a good vice clamp there, and I clamp that to my saw bench. Before I finish drum sanding that body, I think I'll glue this little scrap onto the peg head, so that's taken care of, and when I get to it, it'll be dry. I switched from the 2 1/4 inch down to a 2 inch drum to get in these cutaways, these tight curves, and I'll switch to a 1 1/2 and a 1 1/8 to get the peg head. These little drum sanders are a nice tool to have. If you feel any distinct lumps or ridges on the outside of the body, work it down with a file. Don't rely on the drum sander completely. It can make a few dips if you're not careful. I bored a 3/4 inch hole in this old scrap of 3/4 inch plywood, turned it round on my lathe, and glued a piece of sandpaper to it. If you replace your saw blade with that drum sander, your table saw can make a great disc sander. It will turn pretty fast, but it does work, and you've got to be sure to sand on the downside, definitely not the upside. You'll pick the piece up and throw it. It's got an awful lot of power since it's a table saw, so you couldn't force the piece into it. It's great to radius the end of that fingerboard and smooth that out. Next, I'm going to run a 3/8 radius rounding bit, an edge rounding bit with a ball bearing pilot that rides against the side all the way around the outside contours to knock the corners off. You can also use a chisel and a file and a spoke shave. crazy as you come into the grain. I'm cutting into the grain and you could get a tear out there. Don't force it, take your time and be sure the bit is sharp. While that router might be faster, there's nothing wrong with a spoke shave or a chisel and a good old-fashioned rasp. If you do use the router, and regardless of what tool you use, stop short right here and right there before you get on these flats, or you'll nub it over and the plate will hang over. You should finish that by hand. I'm laying out the little marks for all my inlay dots down the fingerboard while I'm waiting for the little piece of maple to dry on the tip of that peg head. Pick it up from your plans and transfer it to the fingerboard. I'm using the number 3 pearl dot from my good buddy Ron Rigsby down there at Stuart McDonald. I found the drill bit that's a perfect fit for it is the B from the letter bit set. I'm going to drill all these holes and pop these pearls in. Put a punch mark on all the holes so that the bit will have something to guide into as you drill. I put them in with a drop of super glue. Just press it home with a little blocks of plexiglass and that'll level it to the rosewood. Wear safety glasses when you're using super glue in case it should splash in your eye. Just takes a dab of hot stuff. I'm using the smaller drum sanders to get in the curves around the edge of the fingerboard and around the peg head shape there. You'll probably have to do certain portions like this by hand. There's not a drum sander that I have that's small enough. Piece of wood I glued on for the ear is dry now and it's also bandsawed to shape too. I'm picking that up while I'm at it. I prefer to shape this butt end of the neck with a hand file, the final fitting of it, rather than risk it on a disc sander or belt sander. And do the same to the pocket on the body. I left the body a little rough so I could sort of mate these two back together, back and forth till they drop in and fit snug. I've got to clean the back of the route up. It won't quite go in yet. See where that overlaps? There's a little wood still hanging out there. Now don't be crazy about a tight fit, because remember you're going to have to lacquer this later. You're going to practice with your lacquer anyway, and you'll find out how much it swells. If I had lacquer on this joint now, it would be way too tight. You have a little tolerance, and I can't really tell you how much, because you have to experiment a little bit. That's a pretty good fit. I'm going to clean up the peg head too with that little drum sander. A little more tracing. I traced this off our plans with carbon paper to get that curve on the end of the head just right. Remember, if you use a disc sander, especially convert your table saw to one, it's awfully powerful. Be really careful. You could file this away in no time at all. Practice on other pieces of hardwood until you get some experience. Use a flat scraper blade and a file to smooth up the bandsaw marks on the face of the peg head. That's the smartest way to go about it. You want to keep it good, flat, plain, and try to get it parallel in thickness. If you don't know how to use a scraper, it's something you should practice on. It's an important tool to learn to use. You want to keep it flat. I'm using my 1.5-inch drum sander on the drill press with a high speed to help sand this radius up into the fingerboard. It's not as easy as it looks. You'll have to be very careful not to sand into the plane of the peg head face. You might finish this with your scraper and a file. Practice on a scrap because this is not as easy as it looks. You'll notice I have it clamped to a block to keep it at 90 degrees from the table. The same block I used on the bandsaw earlier. Clean up that final line with a scraper and a file. I'm using some wax paper over the back of this neck. I've chosen for the neck shape a mid-60s neck that I like the shape of better, and it's a little more popular. It's more rounded and not that boat neck shape. I rough bandsawed 3 blocks of wood almost to the curve and fill it with Bondo again, Freeman Tough Fill. Over the cellophane I press that Bondo down and let it set for a few minutes, and it takes the next shape. I'm doing this at the 1st fret, the 5th fret, and the 12th fret. Well, it's really closer to the 2nd fret, I guess. Those 3 shapes will be your guides for rasping the neck to shape later. These are our templates. Let it set for about 5 minutes. You'll find the Bondo will clean up the easiest if you get it within the first 3 or 4 minutes. It's still a little soft and you can cut it with an X-Acto knife blade. You can make your blocks by tracing off the planes on cellophane and transferring it to blocks of wood. You'll need 3 checkers to get the right curve. I'm only curving the maple part. I don't curve the rosewood, the fingerboard. Some people like the edges of their fingerboard perfectly flat, and some people round them over a bit on the edges, and that's your choice. I'm going to clamp the block of maple for the neck to a good stout piece of wood on my table saw and go at it with a hand rasp. There's a good setup. There's that block of ash again, and it's clamped to the table saw. It gives me a good overhead shot with the rasp to come in there and file. We've got a lot of meat to take off of this, and don't be shy. With your radius blocks in hand, and they won't hardly fit yet, put a little pencil on the back of the neck and stay off the very back. Get a hold of a good rasp or a 4-in-hand file and start tearing off the wood. Pay attention to which way the grain wants to chip, because as you get down there later, you want to know that. Don't be shy, because we have a lot to take off. You can use a draw shave if you practice with one first and get a feel for which way the grain's running. Make yourself a pencil line pretty close to the fingerboard, and don't take too big a cut close to that rosewood and maple joint with this huge tooth file. Save that for your finishing file later, because you could tear a chunk out by mistake. As you start to near that pencil line, which is the round over edge, and as you knock the whole corner off, you'll roll that file slightly as you're filing. Practice this on a chunk of wood before you take the neck you've spent so much time making. It might take you 2 hours to shape this neck or longer. Don't be surprised if it does. Remember, this style of neck, like on this Strat here, swoops up from the 15th fret or slightly past it to the 14th fret, and it's sort of cut out there and scooped, and it meets the flat of the back of the neck again there. It's a compound curve, and you'll have to see it with your eye and draw it with pencil there. So when you're rasping away, be careful up there. Approach that slowly. Don't get too rough in that area. By the same token, be discreet when you get to this area of the peg head. It rolls. You can't take a black line off of a piece of paper and be exact. You can see the shape of the black line would be the shape of the peg head, but everything else is sort of rolled on smooth radiuses into the back of the nut where the neck begins. Imagine that in your mind's eye and work it out with a file. A lot of chunks got to come off that corner and this corner. You might want to use a smoother file when you get down there. Start to get closer, keep checking with your radius gauges. When it starts to fit, switch to like a bastard file. Get rid of that rasp. I make my gauges so that when this edge meets the maple and the rosewood, that's when it should fit the neck. I don't bother with the fingerboard part. I'm only radiusing the maple. There, now that's getting plenty close enough, and it's time to switch to a gentler file like the Moore Bastard. all the way down the neck. We'll follow that with a sander and some sandpaper. Check the radius all the time. Don't be in a hurry. Along with the radius gauges, use a straight edge and roll it around the length of the neck and check for high or low spots. Off your plans, pick up the contour lines and do them as you see fit. I don't like as much of a contour here as most people do. You're going to use the same rasps and tools to do that, both front and back. This alder goes easy. That's where the arm rests. You have to file that and grind that down from these 2 points inwards. That part of the bevel, and it kind of snakes up to the body bevel. You can make the height of that bevel. I'm marking that out with a pencil right now. Whatever you think is comfortable for you. And don't forget the arm bevel. That's where you put your arm across when you play. Follow that rough rasp with a half-round bastard file, and when you get all the contours and all the edges the way you like them, we'll go to sandpaper. Before the sandpaper, I'm using a milling bit in my drill press table, and I'm machining the bottom of these cavities flat. I'm getting rid of these spur marks. This is 5/8, cleanups to 5/8. This will be 3/4. Although the original was 5/8, I drop it to 3/4 to leave plenty of room. You can also use your router to do all this cleanup work. I'm using a milling cutter on the drill press because I can reach the bottom of these deep holes. Be careful not to drill into the side walls. I took a piece of 3/8 drill rod, and with a B letter bit I drilled a hole in the end of it, about an inch deep hole. Got a hollow hole right through the center of it, and I ground the outside down to a thin diameter. What I did was made myself a small cutter bit. I took a sharp file and filed one tooth on it and back filed the rest so it came around in a circle lower than the cutting edge. What you have is a little plug cutter now, and if you drill into PVC pipe with that plug cutter, you can get a whole bunch of little PVC plugs, and they'll give you those old clay dot inlays for your fingerboard if you don't want pearl. There's that one tooth edge, and that cuts a plug that you can push out. See that tooth? And this edge rounds around and comes down below it. So the only thing that's cutting is that one tooth. Doesn't take long to make one of them. The end result will fool just about anybody if they like those clay dots. You drill a little deeper hole for these and sink that plastic right down into the rosewood. For my side markers, I'm using a 1/16 inch white plastic dowel rod that I got from Stuart McDonald. Mark out the holes exact center between the frets, double them up at the 12th fret, clamp it vertical to the drill press and clamp it square into a block of wood, and very carefully drill those holes with a 1/16 inch bit. I run the bit in reverse first to get it centered on itself, then put it into forward speed. This you can do with a hand drill even. It's pretty easy.
Drop of hot stuff and just poke her down in the hole. Clean them up with a smooth mill file. With the bottom of your cavities all cleaned up smooth, the square marks are gone. File and radius the edges so it'll take paint well. Next we're going to finish sand the neck and the body. This large Sunstrand orbital sander, my trusty Rockwell sander, the Speed Block sander, that's my favorite. I'll probably use my DA air sander a bit, but there's nothing wrong with a block of wood and sandpaper. I'd use 80 grit and 120. Work down all the rounds with 80 grit first, get rid of the file marks. Basically use a block of wood and move a lot on the surface of the guitar on all the flats. In other words, don't stay in one place too long. Keep moving and keep it flat and check it with the straight edge. I'm not going to spend a lot of time sanding because that'll be obvious. Sand till the marks are gone, both sides. Before the final finish sanding of the neck, smooth up the fingerboard with some 220 sandpaper. I'm using a whetstone as a flat block, just to level those pearls or the clay inlays in. I think we should fret this before we do the final sanding. Damp it down lightly with a damp rag, let it dry and sand it one more time, just so it's nice and smooth. You can go to a 400 if you wish. It'll give it a fine polish. I'm pre-bending this number 148 Stuart McDonald wire. It's more in keeping with the vintage of this type of instrument. It's a little thinner than the real heavy rock and roll wire. I'm bending it to the fingerboard radius before I nip it. I run the nippers up to the fingerboard edge and grab the wire and lift it out of the slots to nip it. If you twist it in the slots, you can tear a chunk of wood out. Hang it a tiny bit over on the side away from you. Run your nippers up close to the edge, then lift the fret out of the slot. Be sure to keep them in order as you go. If you find a little chip or there's a mark here up by the 17th fret, put a little drop of super glue on it. Drop a little of sawdust that you just sanded off the fingerboard into that, and tamp it down. Let it dry for about a minute and file it flush with the file and continue sanding the board. Those type of fills are usually invisible when you're done. Rest the neck on something flat and hard. I'm using my table saw bent so it will take a blow. Take the pre-bent fret and it's cut to length. Dip each end in the drop of super glue. I put super glue on this piece of plastic. You have to practice this on a scrap piece now till you get good at it. It'll stick to your fingers. Be careful. Set one glued end in the fret slot, line it across, and come in with your hammer. Start on one side and hammer across. It doesn't hurt to hold one edge down with your finger as you go. Now, you don't even need glue on a fret job, but I always use it. These fingerboards are pretty accurately slotted and they'll hold the fret dry. I got a little too much glue here. It's super glue and it splashed out. That can be a pain to clean up, so you might want to take a little wax. I've got some paste wax here in a can and it's a dark brown color that'll match the board. Use some of that to pre-wax the fingerboard so that the glue won't stick to it if you do get a squeeze out. Leave a dry area along the fret and just wax up close to where the fret's going to be. Do that on both sides of the fret before you glue it in. Then the super glue cleans off a lot easier.
This dead blow hammer is a great fretting hammer. If super glue makes you nervous, and of course you should be practicing this on scraps of wood anyway to get the technique down. Super glue is hard to use. Use a little Titebond. Run it in the crack, clean the excess out, remove the tape. Titebond will hold a fret in. It just is a little easier to use too. It doesn't hold the ends down quite as well, and some fret jobs the ends don't tend to rise up anyway. When you get down to the curve of the neck, be sure to use a curved block behind the hammer as you strike to sort of act as an anvil. I have one friend that lays masking tape along the edge of the fingerboard, puts a drop of super glue on the bare fret slot, and it runs down through the other side, and then he pounds his fret in. That method works great. The super glue tends to run a bit, but it'll harden and you can pick it up when you do your finish sanding. It really holds the fret in all the way across too. Super glue runs the whole length of the slot and holds that fret in. Practice with super glue. It's hard to use. I'm just showing you different ways of fretting. Super glue applied to the slot on one end runs right down and out the other. When the frets are all in, I'm using a 6-inch piece of smooth mill file that I ground off on both ends, sort of round so it doesn't catch, and I'm leveling the fret ends to the fingerboard. When they come nice and flat and smooth and don't catch, give it a slight bevel. The bevel of your choice. Depends on how you like your fret jobs. I don't like to have too great a bevel. Using a smooth mill file. The fret tang end is smooth and there's a slight bevel on its end. You can fill this little fret end slot below it with some powdered rosewood dust and super glue. A dab of glue and a little sawdust forced into it would make a good filler. With those fret ends done, we can dry assemble the guitar parts. While a 1/4-inch hole was fine for the shaft of the tuning key, you'll need to drill 11/32 to clear a hole for the bushing. That hole doesn't have to go all the way through the peg head. You drill it deep enough that the bushing will press down in. Hold the peg head down really tight while you're trying to drill one hole within another hole. That's a little tricky, but you can do it. Set your depth stop so you don't drill through. Line them up straight and mark out their screw holes with a scribe. I used a number 49 bit with a piece of masking tape as a depth stop. Get the proper measurements from your plans and locate the bridge on its center lines and locate the outer 2 holes. Drill 3/32 to clear the threaded part of the screw and 9/64 to clear the shank. That's sort of a countersink. Clamp the neck to the body, put on the 2 outside strings, use a wooden dowel for a temporary nut, just to hold those strings in place. Clamp the neck in its pocket like so. Now you can straighten the strings up with the neck, see? Get it where it should be. Tighten that clamp and mark it from the rear with an 11/32 bit. Mark the 4 holes. You can drill those neck holes in the maple with a 1/8 bit. That's a good size to hold a good thread. I run the screw down in there and sort of pre-tap each hole into the maple. To mount the claw, those 2 holes that hold the claw will go 3/8 of an inch down from the back of the guitar, and they'll be on center with your plans. You'll need a really long bit to get the right angle. If you don't get the right angle, then the claw will rise up above the body, and you don't want that. So shop around for a really long drill bit, and that's the angle that you're looking for. Really shallow. As long an angle as you can get and still get the drill motor in there. You wouldn't want to pick the bit up at too steep an angle like this. That wouldn't work. If you haven't got a drill bit, you can put the claw in by hand, forcing the screw slowly into the soft alder. Go ahead and lay out all your screw holes for the jack plate and the pick guard.
Be sure you line the pick guard up underneath the strings so the pole pieces line up under the strings. Mark out those holes and drill them. Pre-fit every hole.
It's good to pre-fit every screw. Drill a hole from this pocket to that for the wires. Don't drill out the back. Go ahead and drill out all the pick guard holes. You've got to lay out the holes for the tremolo cavity plate and drill them. Right now is a good time to lay out pencil line. Later we'll chisel a little channel so we can get this nut driver onto the nut when we want to adjust the neck. You'll need to drill a hole 2 7/16 of an inch back from the front wall of the tremolo pocket. This is a rear view. That's the treble side. That's your ground wire hole. Once again, it's a good shallow angle. You get a long bit and drill up into the cavity where the volume controls are. Lay out your nut blank, bone, brass, or ivory. Plastic is fine. And give it a rough shape to the approximate size. That line's the approximate fret height, and I can file the top down and slightly round it to the rear, close to the height where I mark the strings. I use the fret end as a guide and slide the string in the same amount on both sides and mark them. Space the strings to suit your own taste. You can use an X-Acto saw or any thin saw to mark the first string, and I have a nice set of nut files for the other strings. StewMac's got a set of 9 nut files that are really great. If you don't wish to buy them all, buy 4, the 16,000, the 19,000, the 23,000, and the 38. You could make any nut if you had to with those 4. I have the whole set. Move the strings around till they line up equally and look good to your eye, and mark each one. This is where the precision nut files come in handy, since they cut a round bottom. I really love them. Be sure to file with a slight backward angle so that the string slopes up to the front of the nut. Follow the radius across the fingerboard. Roll the file to create a round bottom. When you get the string heights the way you want, flush up these ends so they're perfectly smooth with the fingerboard, and final sand the nut. Smooth and round it with 220 and 400 sandpaper, and give it a light drop of glue and drop it in the slot. Let that set, and now when we finish sand the edge of the fingerboard, we'll pick up the edges of the nut at the same time, and later spray over both. While you're waiting for that to dry, go ahead and mount one of your string retainers. Follow your plans. Use 2 if you like. Traditionally it only had 1. Some people screw them right down to the face, and others use spacers. There's a little chrome plated spacer for this one. We're really ready to disassemble this thing now and final sand it and get to the spraying part. It's not really a good idea to play this too much right now. You might get the neck all dirty. Try to avoid. With a damp rag, damp the whole body down a couple of times and do the neck as well. That'll raise the grain, and you can cut it down with your 220 sandpaper. 220 is probably fine enough. Sand to 400 if you wish. I'm going to spray this a sunburst, and I can hide a lot of scratches along the edge if I have any. When I say damp sand, I mean wait till it dries. You don't sand it while it's wet. That would be wet sanding, which you do on the lacquer later. This is called a damp sand. Just damp all the wood and let the grain rise and dry. Takes about 20 minutes to dry. While I'm waiting for the wood to dry, I'm going to adjust my truss rod and get this neck perfectly straight so the straight edge will sit on all the frets, and give it a quick fret level.
Going clockwise with the wrench fights against the string's pull and will give the neck back bow. Going counterclockwise, the opposite direction, will force the neck into an up bow. It's a two-way rod. Very clever. I ground off the tip and the tang of a 10-inch mill file and got a 6-inch piece and rounded its ends. Starting at the first fret, I'm just pissing down the high spots and leveling any imperfections out. This won't take very much. The neck is in a straight position. If you mark the top of each fret with a magic marker, you'll know when all the frets have a level top. When the black is removed. Follow that with a block of wood and some 220 sandpaper to remove the file scratches. Now bring those flat tops to a round using a crowning file or rounding file. Doesn't take much, just a slight taste because this is a smooth fret job. You might like a 3-cornered file that the edges have been ground smooth on. It's also great for dressing and crowning frets, especially for cleaning up the beveled end and removing any burrs. Finally, tape each fret off so you don't scratch the board, and use 400 paper to bring it really smooth. Go right over the ends and polish that with steel wool. Do that to each fret. Do it now before you do the spray work, and you won't be chipping that lacquer later. Finish up with 220 grit sandpaper and pay special attention to the contours. Blow or wipe the dust off of it, and we can put a yellow alcohol stain as a base for our sunburst. Catch the neck up to the body with 220. You can go as far as 400 if you wish. Remove all marks and dirt. I don't think we'll stain this, but I'm thinking about it. A steel scraper removes all the scratches that sandpaper won't touch. Any good finishing expert will use a scraper almost more often than he will sandpaper. It gets in those hard places too. I'm using the yellow stain. It's a methanol or alcohol stain straight. If you like a weaker yellow, mix it with this reducer. Experiment on scrap wood. You can wipe it on with the rag. Some people prefer to spray it. It doesn't waste so much if you wipe it on, and with sunburst it won't look very blotchy anyway. Wipe with the grain lengthwise and move fast. It's really soaking into this alder. It's hard to show a yellow on camera, but yellow it is. You'll see the yellow better when the lacquer gets on it. Let it dry for an hour. While that's drying, tape off the fingerboard so only the side gets sprayed. Use masking tape. The ends of the frets can show. Right over the nut, cut off the excess so we don't get any lacquer on that board. This maple is so hard and dense, and being non-porous, we don't really need to seal it. I'm going to spray this neck with an aerosol can, the Balin lacquer. You could do the whole body with that if you don't have an air compressor. I'm going to use the air compressor for the sunburst, however. But I've done remarkable jobs with spray cans. Look at that quarter sawn grain. That's a beautiful neck.
Let me run down the steps. First, spray the peg head, both face and back, down to about the 3rd fret and stop. Turn it around and spray the heel, around the back, around its sides, and also down towards the middle of the dry area of the neck and stop. Now, to finish the center part of the neck, you can lay it on a flat board or spray it in the hanging position. Keep the gun fairly far away from the neck, trigger on and off, and you'll save lacquer. Start with a light coat. There's no hurry.
Lay down a block of wood and spray it laying flat. Don't hold the can too close. When you're spraying in the flat position like this, you could actually get 2 coats on at once because it won't tend to run as much. I'm going to let that dry for about an hour while I mix up some stains for the sunburst. The yellow body's dry now. This is a quart spray gun that I generally use for my big spray work, like spraying a body and stuff. Then this is a door jamb gun. That's what it's known as in the auto business. I spray sunburst with that. If you have neither, you don't need to feel bad. You can use the Spray It by the Preval company. You can put any color or lacquer in there, and it's got an aerosol top. Here I've mixed the yellow and brown Solar Lux stain with clear lacquer to spray over that neck to give it that old and yellow vintage look, I guess you could call it. After about a half an hour, this neck is dry enough to dust sand. I'm only sanding off any little raised specks or spots on the finish. Lightly sand with 320 silicon carbide. With this baby, a real light coat is important. We just want to give it a little bit of a tone. Before doing anything, as far as the sunburst is concerned, I'm going to put some sealer over that yellow stain. I've got my friend Brian Gallup that works in the shop spraying for me so I can film. He's laying it on heavy, and it won't surprise me if we have to put 2 or 3 coats of sealer over the yellow stain to prepare it for the sunburst. Alder really soaks up lacquer, you'd be surprised. I'm using a big gun here, but you could use aerosol cans to do this with. It would take a little longer, that's the only problem. Lay it on thick, but watch out for runs. Follow this spray schedule. I sprayed 3 coats of sealer over that yellow stain because the alder really soaked it up. And now I'm scuff sanding it with 220 blue silicon carbide. Remove any high spots or fur balls and you're ready for the sunburst. Very lightly. First I'm going to spray another coat of clear on that neck. This is my 3rd coat. I'm going right over that color. I don't want to sand on the color because you could sand through and hit a white patch. If you don't use color, it doesn't matter. Here I'm using straight Solar Lux red in a Preval unit on bare wood. This is a different body. Never trigger while you're on the body. Don't release the trigger till you're off or you'll get a spatter. This is bare wood. On our guitar I'm using the same red stain, but I mixed it with sealer for a more translucent effect. Don't trigger off or on when you're looking at the guitar. This is a little clearer lacquery look. Spray away from center. Here I'm sunbursting right on the bare wood. This isn't the guitar we made, it's an ash-bodied guitar that I'm practicing on. You should practice on scraps of wood, I think, before you do either. Here I'm using it over the sealer coat. I'm using my DeVilbiss door jam gun to sunburst the back here. This is mixed with lacquer. Here I've mixed a little black, Solar Lux black with sealer again. I've got a black shader, just like I made a cherry shader. There's a good wet coat of sealer. Let that dry for an hour and we can sand it out and hit it again. I'm using a pre-made pickguard on my guitar. If you want to make your own, take the shape from your drawing and transfer it to a sheet of plastic using cellophane and carbon paper again. Leave on this protective plastic so you don't scratch it. Bandsaw that to shape. Drill out those holes.
The rest is all filing. Work off the edge of your bench. Finish all the edges with a scraper. Sand them if you wish. I've sprayed my 4th coat of lacquer and I'm lightly sanding that with 320 blue paper. After that I'll go on to the 5th coat. I'll follow the 5th coat with one more, which I think will be my final coat because I'm getting a good build.
Now let's see, I have 3 coats of sealer over the yellow, and now I've put 3 coats over the sunburst, so that's 6 coats of sealer on this body. But the first 3 coats really soaked into that alder.
Be especially careful of any sharp edges along all the cutaways and the body bevel. Just a light sanding. That's what a 320 scuff sand looks like. All you're doing is knocking off the dust. It doesn't have to be all sanded out. I mix my lacquer and thinner 50-50, half lacquer and half thinner. I do the same with the sealer. A 50-50 mix. I strain it through a strainer. You never know what you'll find. We're ready for our gloss coat. I've got nothing to do while the neck's drying and the body's drying. I'm going to solder up the electrics. Heat that pot before you apply the solder. Get a little solder on that pot for grounding and on this one. It's best to get the part hot and then put the solder on. On the volume pot, you're going to have to bend this lug in and solder it to the case as well. For delicate parts like this capacitor, I'm using brass alligator clips as heat sinks to draw the heat away from the part. I pre-tin every connection with a little solder so it's ready to receive a wire. Run your wires down through the cavity to the rear pickup and over to the control pocket. The greens are all grounds and go to the volume pot right here, and the whites all go to the switch. Those are the hot leads. Greens are ground. The keys to get the part hot first. There goes the neck pickup, looking from the spring side. There's the middle, and the bridge. Wiring is pretty straightforward if you just follow the simple direction that came with your plans. I'll leave the rest up to you. Those were just some helpful tips, I hope. I'm using some 400 paper, a block of wood, and some water, and I'm wet sanding any humps off. I got a few dust specks in there. I generally don't wet sand after the first gloss coat, but this went on pretty thick. Keep a rag around and keep wiping off the excess water so you can see what you're sanding, otherwise everything just looks shiny anyway. And the idea is to wash off the crud on the sandpaper in your bowl of water. It's this chalky stuff that builds up on the paper, so you want to wipe it off and wipe it off the guitar body. Dip the paper in water and wipe the crud off the paper, keep it clean. If you get good at this, you could do a whole guitar with one sheet of 400 just by washing it off every 30 seconds. It's kind of moist outside, and the smart man would use a little lacquer retarder. That slows down the drying time.
maybe 2 capfuls per quart, or read the instructions on the can. If you get a blush, that's when the lacquer will turn bluish or whitish because the moisture can't escape. I'm ready for my second coat. Now Brian really lays the lacquer on thick, so our coats are a good heavy coat. This is the second coat, and I just added retarder to it. You've got to hold the guitar level to get in the cutaways. It's tricky to get in there.
Hey Dan, what are you doing?
Well, I was just trying to test the parts out on this guitar, but you're right, I shouldn't. You shouldn't mess with the guitar at all until it's all done and dry and you've rubbed it out. That's why we went to all the trouble to pre-assemble the parts.
2 days later, my third coat is on there and dry, and I'm wet sanding it out with 400 and 600 paper. Wipe it off and with a rag. You'll get a dull look to the finish this way, but rubbing compound will bring that to a high polish. Here's what the finish looks like after 600, very dull and hazy. I'm using a Balin neutral compound to rub this finish to a high gloss.
Get a good blob of rubbing compound on a piece of damp diaper rag. And I hold it in my lap for most of my rubbing. Some people like to rub in swirls and some people rub lengthwise. Try both ways and it takes a lot of elbow grease. When the dullness is gone and the whole body starts to take a nice glossy shine, it's time to switch to Meguiar's Mirror Glaze number 4. This is a much finer compound. It's more of a polishing compound, and that will remove any scratches that the rubbing compound left. This takes a lot of arm pressure, though. You can see a shine like that bottle reflecting there. Switch to the green stuff. This is a very fine polishing compound. Some people call it a swirl mark remover. We're going to do the same operation to the neck.
Polish off any fingerprints with a dry rag. I use a diaper rags. And you can assemble the guitar. Remember that ground wire goes to the tremolo claw. When you get to the jack, heat sink that ground wire as you solder it so you don't melt the delicate insulation on the white hot lead.
Well, that about wraps it up. We've got a guitar here. For my guitar, I chose 2 Schaller pickups in the front, and I stuck a Bill Lawrence in the rear so I could compare the difference in sound. If you have a further interest in guitar work, I have a whole series of videotapes on guitar repair, maintenance, setup, what have you. Contact the folks at Stuart McDonald if you're interested. I'd like to thank everyone at Stuart McDonald for inviting me to be your instructor, and thank you for being with me. Let's see how it sounds.